Good evening. Welcome to the Ritsumeikan Center for Asia Pacific Studies webinar series, current research webinar series. My name is Yoichiro Sato. I'm a professor at the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Good evening. Welcome to the Ritsumeikan Center for Asia Pacific Studies webinar series, current research webinar series. My name is Yoichiro Sato. I'm a professor at Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University. Tonight, we have two guests, very distinguished guests from Southeast Asia joining us for discussions. And let me first introduce Dr. Ian Storey, who is a senior fellow at the ISEAS Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. And since joining ISEAS in 2007, Dr. Storey has been the editor-in-chief of the peer-reviewed academic journal, Contemporary Southeast Asia. Many of you aspire to have a paper published in this journal. Ian specializes in Southeast Asian security issues with a focus on the major powers, especially the United States, China, Japan, and Russia, and maritime security issues. He's one of the world's leading experts on the South China Sea dispute. He's also a regular commentator in the media and has been quoted by various global media. So prior to joining ISEAS, he was also associate professor at the Daniel K. Inoue Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Honolulu, Hawaii, where he was my colleague a number of years. And also he taught as assistant professor at Deakin University in Victoria, Australia. Our second guest is Dr. Khoo Ying Hooi. She is the deputy head and senior lecturer at the Department of International and Strategic Studies, University of Malaya. She completed her PhD in politics and government, examining social movements and democratization with a focus on Malaysia's electoral reform movement. Ying Hooi is currently also a columnist in a local Chinese newspaper, Sinchu Jitpo. I hope I'm pronouncing the Chinese word properly. Ying Hooi, was it okay? Ying Hooi is the editor-in-chief of Malaysian Journal of International Relations, and she sits in the board of editors with the Journal of Current Southeast Asian Affairs and Indonesian Law Review. She has also a kind of activist side as well, and she has served in the various capacities in both governmental commissions as well as the international NGOs. She was member in the Amnesty International Malaysia, and prior to academic career, she also worked in the corporate sector as well as Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. So she has various careers prior to the present position, but I think for the sake of the time, I will go to the first speaker and ask Ian to give his remarks. Go ahead, Ian. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Yoichiro. It's nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
And I think good evening to most of the people who have joined this webinar. I've been told most of you are in Japan and Southeast Asia, so good evening. But for those of you who have joined us from North America, good morning. Well, so what I want to talk about tonight is the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic on US-China relations and how that has impacted Southeast Asia. Now, we're only, what, 4 to 5 months into this crisis, and it's clear that it's going to go on for many more months and possibly for several more years. It's turned both our professional and personal lives upside down. It's hit the global economy very hard, and that situation is likely to get much worse in the coming months. The long-term impact on international relations are, of course, unknowable at this point. But what is clear is that the pandemic has worsened the already tense relationship between the United States and China. As Washington and Beijing have argued and squabbled over the origins of the virus, which country did a better job of trying to contain it, and also who's doing the most to help other countries around the world in terms of providing medical assistance. It's obviously too early to say, but I would say that this is probably not a rupture event or a tipping point for the countries of Southeast Asia. Now, I say that because I think the pandemic has reinforced negative views of both the US and China that existed before this crisis, and also exacerbated concerns about what escalating superpower rivalry means for Southeast Asia. So in January of this year, my institute, the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, we published a survey of elite opinions on regional politics and security. And that survey did not provide a heartwarming reading for either China or the United States. When it came to China, 72% of respondents expressed concern about China's growing economic influence in the region, and 85% about its strategic and political influence in Southeast Asia. A meager or a miserly 1.5% of respondents saw China as a benign power. And only 60% had little confidence in China's ability to do the right thing. It didn't make much better reading for the US. Less than half of respondents felt that the US could not be relied on to do the right thing. And 77% felt that America under Trump was disengaging from Southeast Asia. Now, several surveys since then from the Pew Research Institute, and also just last week from CSIS in Washington, have tended to reinforce some of the findings in the ISEAS survey. So before COVID-19 came along, Southeast Asian leaders were already greatly concerned about the trajectory of US-China relations and whether Southeast Asia would become the cockpit of great power rivalry. And that situation would force Southeast Asian states into making binary choices when it came to issues such as trade pacts, security arrangements, technology, especially 5G, arms sales, etc. Southeast Asian countries have not only been unimpressed with the lack of cooperation between the US and China, but also with America's failure to provide leadership during the worst crisis since World War II. And also very concerned by the very high death rate, the highest in the world, from COVID-19 in the United States. China has seized on America's faltering response to COVID-19 and attempted to show the world that its superior authoritarian governance system was much better suited to dealing with this crisis. It's also used misdirection by trying to obscure the origins of the virus and by trying to portray itself as the global savior through its provision of medical assistance to countries around the world. Now, whether this China's face mask diplomacy will help improve its image in Southeast Asia remains to be seen. I think we'll start to know that when we get the survey results early next year, when we do this survey again. But I suspect that it won't improve China's image at all in the region. The main reason for that, I think, is China's rather cynical and opportunistic behavior in the South China Sea over the past few months. Since the beginning of this year, China's assertive activity have raised tensions in the South China Sea a few notches. In February, a Chinese warship aimed its guns at a Philippine vessel. In April, China sent a survey ship and escort vessels into Malaysia's exclusive economic zone, and soon after announced the establishment of 2 new administrative districts to govern the Paracel Islands and Spratly Islands. In response to these activities, the US has conducted 5 freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea this year, 4 of them since March, mainly in the Paracels, but also in the Spratly Islands. And both the US and the Southeast Asian claimants have rejected the legality of China's 9-dashed line by submitting notes to the UN Secretary General in response to a submission by Malaysia late last year. It's important to note, though, that none of these activities that China has conducted have resulted in major strategic gains. They haven't shifted the balance of power in the South China Sea at all. And in many ways, these actions have become routine events. In fact, almost all of them we saw last year as well, and probably the year before that too. Nevertheless, China has used them to signal to Southeast Asian countries that COVID-19 has not distracted it from its commitment to assert its territorial and maritime jurisdictional claims in the South China Sea, that the virus has had no impact on the operational readiness of the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force, and also that not only is America the main cause of rising tensions, but that its commitment to the region is rather shaky, and that Southeast Asian countries should not put their faith and trust in the United States. As a result, I think we can expect to see tensions continue to rise in the South China Sea in the second half of this year, as China doubles down on its claims. I think we'll see China holding more high-profile naval exercises in the South China Sea in the coming months. I think we'll see it tightening its enforcement of its annual fishing activities in northern parts of the South China Sea. In fact, just last week, a Vietnamese fishing boat was harassed by a Chinese Coast Guard vessel near the Paracel Islands. I think we'll see more of these kinds of incidents before the fishing ban ends in August. And I think the US will respond by increasing the tempo of its FONOPS, freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. I expect we'll see another 6, 8, maybe more FONOPS in the Paracels and Spratlys before the end of the year is out. Now, all of this is going on while talks between ASEAN and China for a code of conduct for the South China Sea remain suspended because of COVID-19. The officials from ASEAN and China have not been able to meet to discuss the code of conduct. and they may not be able to meet until later this year or even next year. So the picture is not a very good one for the South China Sea moving forward into the next 6 months. And on that note, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Yang. Now let me turn to Ying Hooi.
Sure. Thank you, Yoichiro. So for my part, the presentation will be more focused on the human rights and democracy in the region. The first part is I would like to just mention about the US-China rivalry, as we know, is not new, as Ian also mentioned. So prior to the pandemic in the region, there's a lot of talk about Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. So it is one of among the central issues in the region. And it is popularly debated under the framework of how China is expanding its soft power in the region. So with the COVID-19 largely contained domestically since March, but of course now they have the current outbreak in Beijing. The Chinese government has pivoted to providing assistance internationally through the mass diplomacy, with Southeast Asian countries as being a particular focus. However, the survey have shown various trends, but what we can observe is that ASEAN governments and the business elites have largely welcomed this diplomacy. At least they don't critically criticize US or China in terms of how they actually manage the pandemic so far that we see. And actually less publicized is really the technical and financial support coming from the US. So Trump's approach definitely in blaming China, denying his failure in managing COVID-19, and his many other actions, such as how he was disengaging with WHO, do not go very well with the international audience. And domestically as well, it has revealed mostly of its fragile healthcare system and so forth. I would like to point to the economic factor that is really crucial in the regions when we put in the framework of the US versus China rivalry. So economic factors are playing a prominent role in shaping the decisions of Southeast Asian leaders on critical issues that divide the two. So as we expected, the economic impact is going to be huge. And some of the impacts coming from the trade investment, tourism, the collapse in the oil prices, drop in the domestic demands due to lockdowns and so forth. The second part of it is I would like to talk about Southeast Asia's responses to COVID-19. As of today, we've seen that Indonesia has the highest numbers of the COVID cases in the region. It has surpassed Singapore today. And but before I move on, I would just like to briefly talk about the current human rights and democracy situation in Southeast Asia by referring to a few index. If we look at the index from the Economist Intelligence Unit EIU Democracy Index, World Press Freedom Index, and the Civicus 2019 report that related to civic space on issues such as freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, and freedom of expression, is very interesting that these indexes is that the responses and the management on the COVID-19 across Southeast Asia has varied, and it does not correlate directly on how democratic or how open the country is. So in Southeast Asia that is already do not have a good records when it comes to democracy and human rights, the health crisis escalates and countries go into different variation of lockdown, the emergencies and so forth. But what is really dangerous is that it has given the Southeast Asian leader extended powers. And many of the cases have shown us that the freedom of press, freedom of expression has been strictly restricted under the name of COVID-19, as well as the term of fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and so forth. So from all the informations of the countries as gathered, almost all countries experience the governments that are increasingly assertive in showing authoritarianism. So there's a high level of anxiety and fear that in certain countries, there's a strong possibility that these special powers might continue and subsequently become a permanent feature in the months and years to come. And I would like to mention as well on the part 3 in the 6 trends as I observe. So how does COVID-19 response impact on the politics, including democracy and human rights in Southeast Asia? We can't see we cannot disentangle the politics, human rights, and democracy. So the first is authoritarianism approach. So as mentioned earlier, the region as a whole has suffered from lack of civil liberties. Generally, while securitization is required, the problem really occurs when the governments do not exercise restraints. And the second trend is the lack of regional solidarity. There's a lot of criticisms coming to the ASEAN as a regional organization in how they manage this pandemic. So this pandemic poses a significant threat to Southeast Asia and the relevancy of ASEAN as it finds itself faced with the unprecedented task of addressing the health and socio-economic cost of COVID-19. So, and the cost on livelihood will be really high, as we can witness now. And the third trend is the increased militarization that is linked to the rise of authoritarianisms. So some countries are falling back on militaries that still command extensive networks in the regions. For examples like Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, and Myanmar. And the second is that the post-transition government, if you look at Malaysia, they also deployed military, and it is really rare to see that kind of trend. And the fourth trend is the limitation in governance capacity. I would really like to highlight this because when we talk about human rights and democracy, there's very little emphasis on how important the governance is. But I think COVID-19 has revealed that the states, while they have basic obligation to provide security, education, public health, and so forth, but they have, what it has revealed is that they are poorly staffed and underfunded in some of the countries. And for example, if you see in Indonesia, the hashtag of Indonesia Terserah, that means whatever Indonesia, is really a depressing of basically it sends a notion of giving up on the situation. So Indonesia was used to be one of the most democratic countries in the region together with the Philippines. And the fifth trend is the pandemic has exposed the glaring inequalities around the region. While the lockdown measures is being put in place, there's a very limited consideration to be put for the marginalized groups and the economic powers and things like that. Public health versus economics. So this is really a dilemma to strike a balance. But I think most importantly is that the policies, the comprehensive policies are not being put in place. And the sixth trends that I would like to highlight is the technology. I think increasingly we see across the world, including of course in the Southeast Asia, the governments are using like contact tracing apps and so forth. And that increases the danger of the surveillance and data privacy issues. So those are the things that have not been tackled. And how would US-China tension impact on Southeast Asia when it comes to this? In my part 4 is, if you look at the ISEAS State of Southeast Asia report, 53%, 53.6% more aligned to US and the 46.4% more aligned to the China. So it is not really too much of a difference. But of course, if you go down into different countries, then you see 7 ASEAN member states who are more inclined towards China. However, despite of the statistic, I must emphasize that we do not see as if they do not engage at all with either one, if let's say if they are aligned with US or China on that. But the other point that I would really like to make is that when we put the US-China rivalry within the framework of the Southeast Asia, there's a lot of talks about authoritarianism approach versus democracy approach. But I think we really need to understand the war between US and China on human rights discourse with the different political system, different levels of economic developments and the divergence cultures and the basic values of the two countries have basically divide the two in how they view human rights and democracy really. But zooming down into the ASEAN or Southeast Asia, is that I think both the US and China are important partners, especially economically when it comes to in the ASEAN countries. So I think they will try the utmost attempt to actually try to balance the two and avoid being too closely being drawn into one camp or the other in terms of the framework of the human rights and democracy. Moving forward, there's 3 points that I would like to highlight. The first point is in my part 5 is the human rights and power relations. So I think the COVID-19 sent the human rights activists messages that there is a need to rethink our strategies and rethink about the narratives, because this COVID-19 has posed a huge challenge in terms of how we want to, as Ian just now mentions, that China's approach and the US approach, but US power has been, the image has been tainted sort of, and together with the China. But if we look at the measures of the Southeast Asian countries, it is rather leaning towards the authoritarianism approach. And if you observe on the ground, people are rather quite happy with that kind of strict measures, but the long-term impact will be something for us to be worried and for us to watch. So I think for the human rights part, there's really a need to build public support and to recognize that is this imbalance of the power relations that shape the people's perception and the worldviews. So for the human rights activists and the civil society groups, there's a need to also how do we actually generate our own economic power specifically to serve human rights. The second point is on the role of non-state actors. Non-state actors, if I move it and just look at the civil society, they are both heroines and villains in different narratives when it comes to global politics. And I think in the Southeast Asian context, the impact of non-state actors is really context dependent. Yeah. And the third point is the regional resilience. The words of resilience is interesting because the word actually originating from Indonesia's concept of national resilience or ketahanan nasional. So it was officially introduced into the ASEAN discourse for the first time at the ASEAN summit in Bali in 1976. So in the 1970s, the notions of resilience acquired an ASEAN dimension to include the level of interactions among member states, the degree of their commitment to the grouping, and also their adaptive capability in facing challenges and opportunities. So in essence, I think we can see the weaknesses coming from the ASEAN mechanism. So the regional resilience is really required. And for the conclusions, when I try to observe on these situations as a Southeast Asians, I really ask myself, do we, the Southeast Asians, really need to choose between the two? But I think the US-China rivalry is also, there's also discourse about the middle powers like South Korea, Japan, and so forth on using them as better examples in managing the pandemic. So thus far, none of the ASEAN states have openly criticized China or either US. So the choice that they must make maybe is not really between the US and China when it comes to human rights and democracy. And rather it is a choice between the future in which they need to be shared rules and norms within a rules-based order that everyone upholds. And while I don't think we can make any generalizations and conclude that crisis management works better in a particular system of government, at least for now, still, I think regardless of whether there's a conclusive evidence, the danger is really there. So if we fail to handle the crisis, people may look toward a system outside of democracy. So the extent depends on how long this pandemic is going to last and its level of impacts on economics and societies. My last point, I would really like to highlight that all human rights are interconnected and interdependent. So the global pandemic means that the government worldwide must take steps to safeguard the right to health of those they serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Ying Hooi. Now, I have a couple of questions I'd like to first ask Ian. In your paper, you talked about the ADIZ, the Air Defense Identification Zone, and so far, the China's assertiveness pretty much things China planned well ahead of the coronavirus pandemic, and it's just that China continues to do the things they planned. But you in the paper says that the declaration of ADIZ or reclamation of the Scarborough Shoal would be a game changer. And I was a little bit curious that you used or instead of putting those two events in a sequence. And I was thinking maybe, some analysts are saying that the reclamation of the Scarborough Shoal would kind of form a triangular shape connecting China-occupied reclaimed bases, and that will enable China to actually exercise air control. But I'm not sure whether such a triangle is necessary or not, and so I wanted to ask you what is your take of this issue?
Thanks, Yoichiro. There's been a lot of rumor and speculation about what might happen next in the South China Sea. There's been some speculation about whether Vietnam will take legal action against China. There's been speculation about whether the Chinese military will try and take Pratas Reef from Taiwan. And I think much less sensationalist is this speculation about whether China will declare an air defense identification zone over the South China Sea. And to your question of, well, is that possible without turning Scarborough Shoal into an artificial island? I think it probably is possible without turning Scarborough Shoal into a man-made island. I think an ADIZ would be largely symbolic for the Chinese, much as the establishment of an ADIZ over the East China Sea in 2013 by China was largely symbolic. China has not attempted to enforce it at all. I think the same thing would probably be true of the South China Sea. I think it would be an attempt by China to try and assert its jurisdiction over the area. If it actually tried to enforce it with civil and military aircraft, it would run into a huge amount of opposition from the international community. And I think particularly in Southeast Asia from Vietnam, if the ADIZ included the Paracel Islands. I'm fairly certain, now I don't know this for sure, but I'm pretty sure that China has had an ADIZ planned for the South China Sea, could be for a decade. It's just a question of the right timing when they want to do it. I'm not sure now is that time to do it, given that China's facing a lot of problems with its neighbors. We just saw just this week the incident with India and the death of 20 Indian troops, problems with Japan, with the United States and the international community over Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. I'd be very surprised if China wanted to add to that list of problems with its neighbors and ADIZ over the South China Sea. It's possible, but I think it's unlikely. And similarly, if I just add, I think that if China made a move against Scarborough Shoal and started to reclaim it, then that would really set back relations with the Philippines. And I think Duterte would see it as a personal affront, and he could turn his China policy on a dime and adopt a pretty unfriendly approach towards China.
Thank you. Yeah. I have one more question to you. The US is trying to demonstrate that it has the capability to project forces over the South China Sea region if necessary, and conducting, as you pointed out, the freedom of navigation operations. But at the same time, I also see that the US moved the B-52 bombers away from Guam back to the mainland bases. And when the tension escalated over the South China Sea, the US actually deployed B-1B bombers all the way from mainland and sent a couple back to Guam on a temporary basis, I believe. And seeing those things, some people reporting that the US is actually not conducting more overflight operations in the South China Sea region, but they're reporting more in public than last year. So what is your take on this, the US capability to project forces from such a long distance? Would that be able to keep up with the pace of things China is doing in terms of the military buildup in the region?
I think we all remember that in March there was a COVID-19 outbreak on 2 US aircraft carriers, the Abraham Lincoln and the Theodore Roosevelt, and that kept them in port in Guam and Japan. And of course, China seized on that incident by trying to portray that the US was not capable of playing a security role in Asia. Now, of course, the US responded very quickly by demonstrating that it could do exactly that. And it announced that almost all of its submarines that were based in Hawaii and Guam were at sea in the Western Pacific. Now 3 aircraft carriers are on patrol in the Western Pacific. That's the highest number since 2017. And there's a 4th in the Middle East that could very quickly move into the Indian Ocean and elsewhere. And then we have these overflights of B-1, B-2, and B-52 bombers. That I think, I mean, you're right, these are not new. As far as I remember, the US was flying B-52s and other strategic bombers over the South China Sea at least twice a month for the last year or so. The Guam thing, I think, is a bit of a red herring. I think that, I mean, that's a change in operational strategy. The US is now deploying these long-range bombers from the mainland, as you say, both to the European theater and to Asia at very short notice and on a more regular basis to demonstrate to its potential adversaries that COVID-19 has not impacted America's operational abilities or commitments around the world, and that they shouldn't try and take advantage of it.
Thank you. Yeah. Now turning to INFE, some Southeast Asian countries are quite, well, reportedly very successful in terms of containing the spread of the coronavirus. And Vietnam has been very actively promoting its own image as a successful example, and also conducting active medical diplomacy to improve relationship with neighbor countries, as well as the United States and European countries. And I think many articles have been written, including the one in the Diplomat recently. But in your view, what are the implications of Vietnam's success? Is there a human rights issue there with things like testing and quarantine and so forth? And also in some other countries, the others are doing it differently, some with more success, some with not so very successful. But what does lockdown mean to different groups of people in each country? Because we have white collar workers who can afford to, work from home, whereas small shop owners' livelihood is at stake, and farmers may not be so worried about the pandemic because they don't live close to the neighbors. And so what are the implications for those socio-economic differences within different countries? I'm sure Ian doesn't have to worry too much about the Singaporean farmers, but there are many, Malaysia, I'm sure the rural parts of Malaysia is very agrarian. So I want to ask Ying Hooi first about this question.
Okay, thank you, Yoichiro. Yes, in the region, I think Vietnam and also actually before that, Singapore was seen as a very successful case because their death rate is really low. But I think the migrant workers' dormitories issues really blew that off actually. And that actually reveals to a whole bunch of sections, as you mentioned, the inequalities as we see. The workers are divided into different layers. So some can afford to stay at home and they don't lose their job, but millions of people are losing their job and unemployed at this moment in the region. And Vietnam as a successful example is really interesting ones when we put in the spectrum of the human rights and democracy, because it's a one-party rule country. So that is precisely my presentations that as this dilemma of, I would say it's premature to say that, and I don't think that there can be a direct correlation of whether you're democratic countries or authoritarian countries, and that correlate to how successful you are. That is why I also bring in the considerations of the governance capacity of countries as well, the institution support that given by the countries to the citizens, as well as the understanding of the state's obligations. When the countries in the region are calling for the lockdown, for instance, there's a lot of focus when it comes to the, they were saying that public health is more important at this moment than the economics. But there's no debates about that in the midst of the pandemic. But I think what's really missing among the Southeast Asian countries is for the government side is really the comprehensive plans that have been put in place, and what are the plans for those groups that are losing their jobs and their livelihoods and so forth. So those are the things that, and the food security is a huge problem as well, especially for those who stay in the urban area, for instance. Well, you mentioned that if those people live in the agriculture sector, maybe there are less problem. And now the region realized that we have to focus, including in Malaysia, then they're saying that, we should actually do more, focus more on agriculture. But when the country is developed, they started to forget about all these important issues as well. So what does lockdown means in each country? I think it just reveals the very glaring inequalities in the regions, that reveals the weaknesses of the Southeast Asian governments in terms of that. I think Thailand is opening up very soon as their main source of one of the key incomes is tourism. If you keep on closing the borders, and closing the borders can cause a lot of damage economically and also for people, migrant workers, for instance. I think Malaysia case is nothing to be proud of, while They have been also saying that Malaysia has contained the pandemic pretty well, but we have not been treating the migrant workers well as well. And equally with the Singapore, I think those are the things that really need a rethink about it. So that is precisely when I say human rights is really in the dilemma when we want to advocate for the public support, because this COVID-19 might shift the people's perceptions that authoritarian approach is better. The lockdown, the stricter you are, the better you can manage the COVID. But I think those who suffer are really the groups who cannot survive without the jobs and so forth. Only the privileged one can still maintain with their what they are having now.
Thank you, Hui. Before I turn to Ian, let me ask the audience. After this, we are going to have a Q&A session, and your questions can be sent through the chat window, and they will be sorted, and I will select some questions to ask the speakers to answer. Ian, go ahead.
So is this in response to the question you asked Ying Hooi, the issue of inequalities and etc.?
On the lockdown issue.
Oh, I mean, yeah, I think Ying Hooi is absolutely right. I couldn't agree more with her. It's we've the situation in Singapore is even starker than it is in Malaysia and other countries, of course. When the virus first came to Singapore, it was praised by the World Health Organization as being the gold standard for dealing with the virus. But things were going well until they didn't. And that was largely because the government didn't pay as much attention, perhaps, as they should have done to warnings about the possibilities of the virus spreading very quickly in the workers' dormitories. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And for the last few months, until very recently, we've had 500, 600, 700 positive tests among foreign workers in these dormitories. It's really shown. I mean, I guess of course we all knew this. Singapore, for those of you who've been here, is an extremely clean and efficient place. But many of the people who keep it clean and efficient are foreign workers. There's something like 325,000 foreign workers here. Actually closer to 500,000, many of whom work in dormitories where the conditions are not great. They're 12 people sharing a room with one toilet, one shower, etc. And it's made people think about, and they do the jobs that the vast majority of Singaporeans don't want to do. But it's this outbreak among foreign workers has really highlighted the issue and made people think about what kind of a society, what kind of a country we live in, and what can be done to improve their conditions moving forward. And I think the Singapore government is doing quite a good job of dealing with this issue, rehousing the foreign workers, making sure that they're getting paid, making sure that they've got access to Wi-Fi and good food. But long term, they're going to have to look at how foreign workers are housed and treated generally in Singapore.
I'd just like to add very briefly about the migrant workers as well. In the case of Malaysia, actually we have a very trending hashtag called Migran Juga Manusia, means migrants workers are also humans. That really reflects how bad the authorities have been treating the migrant workers, because they're treated as a different class of humans, not the same class as the locals. So those are the things are really glaring in the case of Malaysia and Singapore as well, as we rely on migrant workers a lot for a lot of sectors that, as Ian pointed out, the locals do not want the job. But the locals still do not really appreciate what they have been helping us economically, yeah, which is really sad, actually, yeah.
Thank you, Ying Hooi. I have a question from APU graduate student in international relations, Ms. Asta Chada, to Ian. In a scenario that China is aggressively pursuing its interests in South China Sea and other nations are dealing with their own situations, like US with COVID, India with COVID and border dispute, and Australia being threatened with trade implications, should it be assumed that China could go undeterred in South China Sea and beyond with no common response from the international community? That's a scary scenario. Ian?
I think that's been the situation for some years now, that China has not been deterred from undertaking these kinds of assertive or even aggressive actions in the South China Sea, despite the criticism from many countries in the region and around the world. China doesn't seem to appreciate or think otherwise about the reputational damage that's being done. I mean, its rejection of the arbitral tribunal ruling in 2016 did damage to China's reputation, but it's recovered from that, and you know, countries have moved on. One of the problems is the response from ASEAN has been rather weak. That's largely because ASEAN is made up of 10 countries, each with differing policies and perceptions of China. Some are claimants in the South China Sea, half of them are not. They don't see that they have a stake in the dispute. They have very close relations with China. They don't want to upset their economic relations with China by criticizing it over the South China Sea. And so ASEAN has a bottom line consensus that it's important to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea, and that the ASEAN and China should work together to agree on a code of conduct. But beyond that bottom line consensus, it's a real problem moving beyond that and coming up with a more resolute or strident position on China's behavior in the South China Sea. I don't think that's going to change moving forward. I think, if anything, the looming economic crisis could well introduce even more strains within ASEAN. I think we're you know, like the Asian financial crisis of 1997, 1998, that this could well hurt ASEAN unity. And on the South China Sea, I don't anticipate that ASEAN will take a stronger position than it currently does.
Thank you, Ian. I have next question to Yin-Hui, and this is from Thammasat University student in international relations. Welcome. Do the NGOs like UNHCR deal with the refugees effectively during this pandemic time? That's the question to Yin-Hui.
Okay. I'm not particularly sure about the other countries, but at least for the situation in Malaysia, that I can share some knowledge is that refugees are not recognized in these countries. So UNHCR has very limited power in terms of what they can do with, especially with the huge number of the Rohingya populations that we have in the countries during these pandemic times. But broadly, I haven't really seen very strong roles in terms of UNHCR, apart from some statements regarding the refugees, because this is really something that have to do with the state and UNHCR relations, and also whether the Southeast Asian countries, particularly that has signed or that has ratified the refugee conventions. So the role and the impact of the UNHCR can be different depending on the country's context in this issue.
Thank you, Hui. I have one more question from APU graduate student in international relations from Hong Kong. Hong Kong's her name, and she actually has published a couple of articles on security issues, very interesting papers. But anyway, her question is, both speakers have talked about the geopolitics in Southeast Asia, both at the international and domestic levels. I want to ask about the impacts of COVID-19 on the geoeconomics. First, as we all know, COVID-19 has a major impact on economies throughout Southeast Asia, which in turn should have an impact on defense budgets. Shrinking budget could refocus the ways and means on actual threats rather than those conjured by political and military elites. How would this affect the South China Sea dispute? And she has a second question. Second, on the one hand, as China continues to flex its muscles, ASEAN could try harder to boost US engagement, both economic and military, in the region. On the other hand, if the US economy itself suffers serious setbacks and takes longer to recover than other economies, including China's, then Southeast Asia would inexorably be drawn into China's economic orbit. Is balancing still a viable strategy for Southeast Asia in the post-COVID world? Long question. I think she has written another paper almost. Let's see. Ian, are you ready to go first?
Yeah, I think so. I think okay. The first part of the question, that's very good. Something I've been doing a little bit of research and writing on. There is an obvious connection between economic growth and how much money a country has to spend on defense. And with this looming economic crisis, I think we can almost guarantee that most countries in Southeast Asia will have to cut their defense budgets and either postpone or cancel some major acquisitions. We're already starting to see signs of that, particularly in Thailand. The Thai Prime Minister has ordered all government ministries to cut their expenditure by 10%. The Defense Department has, the various services have put forward what they intend to cut. There's been talk of postponing the payments, but not, I think, the acquisition of 2 submarines from China and some other equipment as well. But I don't think these will be cancelled. I think they will be merely postponed. I think we can expect to see some, I mean, in the case of Malaysia, its defense budget was already being cut because of the economic problems. I think we'll see further cuts. Indonesia too. I think the 2 countries that are unlikely to reduce their defense spending very much is Vietnam and Singapore for 2 reasons. Well, in the case of Singapore, it still has enormous financial resources to support it. And as with Vietnam and Singapore are the 2 countries, I think, in Southeast Asia that both think strategically and long term. And certainly in the case of Vietnam, it has a strongly vested interest in maintaining strong armed forces as a deterrent against overt Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. So I'm not sure that Vietnam will cut its defense budget or its acquisitions. And I don't think Singapore will either. I think some of the other countries will. That means, say, for Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei and Philippines, they will have less capabilities to monitor and survey what's going on in their own waters. And that will create opportunities for China to push harder in those areas. On the second question, being inexorably drawn into China's orbit, I think that might be a bit of an exaggeration. It's hard to say how this is going to affect the US economy. It probably will be hit very badly. How quickly it recovers is unclear. But the US is still has a huge economic presence in Southeast Asia. It's a huge investor. It has important trade relationships with Southeast Asian countries. And even if that relationship, if the US economy is severely impacted, well, Southeast Asian countries have other choices as well. It's not just a case of, this notion that Southeast Asian countries, they must, excuse me, either choose China or the US, in some ways is a bit simplistic. There's always other choices. There's the European Union, there's Japan, there's South Korea, there's Australia, etc., etc. So there are other choices. And also we mustn't take for granted that the Chinese economy is going to come out of this stronger. I think the Chinese economy will be weakened by the pandemic, mainly because demand from Europe and North America for Chinese manufactured goods is going to plummet.
Hui?
Okay, I'll answer the second question. Yeah, the second question says, I just now in my presentations, I mentioned that I think in the region of Southeast Asia, there's been so much talk about US versus China in the Southeast Asia, as if Southeast Asia only have two choices. But I think if politically and economically, as Ian just now has pointed out, they really have more choices when it comes to economies. And moreover, the US and the China's image both are not going too well in the region, except for economic benefits. And I don't think Southeast Asian governments want to risk any of them to go very strong against them politically or economically and lose one of the partner, because I don't think they can afford to disengage or whatsoever in this sense. And the questions about the balancing and the post-COVID-19, I think there have been some discussions about the hedging as well, hedging, balancing, or bandwagoning. Of course, that's not really something that's doing, but maybe the hedging of confrontational elements and the cooperative elements, as we can see right now, is probably something that we can observe in the longer term. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I have a question from my colleague, Dr. Utpavias, to Ian. Usually, as China pursues control in the South China Sea, it also, at the same time or in waves, offers more in investment and other kinds of public diplomacy in Southeast Asia. Is there any sign that Southeast Asian governments and people are becoming more skeptical than before of Chinese intentions with the BRI, etc.? Or is there not really any change? And actually, there's another question to Infi also. Is there any sign that non-state, sorry, I was screwing up with the mouse. Here we go. Okay. Is there any sign that non-state actors or sub-state actors have a chance to show that they can contribute to governance, especially in countries with weaker governance? In the US, sub-state and non-state actors seem to have stood up in response to poor leadership and weak governance at the federal level. Is there any sign of this in Indonesia or elsewhere in Southeast Asia? Okay, let's start with Ian.
I'll take a stab at the first question. Are Southeast Asian countries more skeptical of Chinese investment, particularly BRI? Well, the answer to that, I think, is that they were already somewhat skeptical about BRI, but not completely. I think in general, most Southeast Asian countries have welcomed BRI as a way of plugging gaps in the infrastructure, because existing multilateral funds were not nearly enough to pay for the infrastructure needs of the region. So in general, countries have welcomed it, but they have learned from the mistakes that other countries in other parts of the world have made, particularly in South Asia with BRI, with Pakistan over Budar, the Maldives over Bridge, Sri Lanka over the port, etc. And they've seen how some of these projects have turned into, as the US would call it, a debt trap, and that China's been able to parlay those into strategic assets. And so Southeast Asian countries have been, of course, very keen to avoid that kind of thing, and have been, I would say, for the most part, largely successful in renegotiating many of those BRI contracts. Malaysia in particular, a few years ago, managed to reduce the price of some of those BRI projects. Myanmar as well. Some BRI projects were already running into problems. The high-speed rail in Thailand, and also the high-speed rail in Indonesia as well. These predated COVID-19. I think that given that Belt and Road is Xi Jinping's signature policy, China, of course, isn't going to give up on this initiative. But I think it will have to recalibrate its policies, be more concerned about the environmental impact of some of these projects and how they negotiate them, and issues over transparency as well. And I think also that China could well run into some problems when, if and when some Southeast Asian countries start to default on some of these debts. I think that that's going to be in some ways a much bigger problem for China than it is for the Southeast Asian countries themselves. But Belt and Road is not dead. It will move forward. And as I said, I think in general, most countries in the region are willing to play along with it and take advantage of it. And as we were just discussed with the last question, Belt and Road is not the only option that Southeast Asian countries have. There are other proposals from the US, from Japan, and from other countries. And I guess what you have to bear in mind as well is that a bit of creative tension between and among the great powers is actually good for Southeast Asian countries, because they can play one side off the other. And we've seen that with high-speed rail and other projects around the region.
Thank you, Jan. Ying Hooi?
Yeah. Actually linking the two questions together, the BRI, because when China started the BRI, there has been already a lot of concerns coming from the human rights groups, non-state actors, in terms of the civil societies group in the region. How will it impact on the human rights in the countries in the region, for instance? And it's quite interesting that ASEAN governments and the business elites, of course, welcome the BRI for giving the economic powers and so forth. But on the ground, really, there has been observations that people are not happy, and there has been protests in countries like Laos and a few other countries that with the BRI expansions to the opening up the dam and so forth, because the human rights violations happening there. But having said that, any sign that the non-state actor have a chance to actually show some to the government to actually flex its muscle, I must say that it is quite gloomy at this time, because we really start with these notions of democracy versus authoritarianism, because of the lockdown measures. It's quite difficult to change the narratives and the public perceptions that strict lockdown and the public health versus human rights, and while the government still have to respect the right of the people. And then people might say that, in the US, they focus on the freedom. So that's how they land themselves into this, the mess. So back to the region, as I mentioned in the presentations, there's this difference of looking on interpretations of the human rights in the region. So those are the really complicated issues. For instance, if you look at the trends of civic space in the region has been declining definitely during this COVID-19. Even in the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights side also have issued the statements, quite alarming statements about what happens in the region with this extended powers to the Southeast Asian governments. If you look at the in the Philippines, with they are introducing the anti-terrorism law in this point of time. If you look at even in the case of Malaysia, we have not been able to have any parliament session, which is very it just unacceptable that the parliament is unable to take place, but only for listening to the King's speech. So there's no debates about our budgets and so forth. So those are the things that really unacceptable. And also Malaysians have arrested so far, if I get the numbers right, is more than 26,000 of people just simply because they don't obey the movement control order that we have, with some jail, prisons, a few months, or a fine and things. So those measures, in general, public like it. So that really sent us a really warning sign that when people say that when you don't obey the lockdown rules, you should be jailed, and that's either punishment, and we are happy because you don't spread the COVID under the name of COVID. So it is really a dilemma. So I would say so far it is not really positive for the non-state actors, because just my last point on that is the ASEAN summit will be we will be having the ASEAN summit in this month. Actually, the latest news is about that we're having it online on 26th June. So every year when they have the summit, the civil society groups will be trying to have an audience with them, but we have not managed to do so this year as well. But we're still trying. Today is 17 June. I'm not sure what will happen in the next few days, but it's always not really able to having an audience with the ASEAN governments, but only handpicked with whoever are more friendly to the non-state actors and the civil societies that we can actually meet and express our grievances. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Ying Hooi, what was the date of the ASEAN summit, did you say?
As far as I know, today it was mentioned 26th June.
Okay, and a virtual summit, I presume.
Virtual, yeah. As of now, I'm not sure whether they're going to change it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, next I have like two related questions. One from Uncle Kenneth, who is a graduate of APU, who's currently doing PhD in Waseda, and also from Tui Ling Gwen. I believe she's a current student at APU. Anyway, both are related to WHO and the coronavirus origin. And can the international pressure succeed in making China admit its fault in causing this pandemic? And the US, since US has withdrawn itself from WHO, well, announced to withdraw from WHO, Trump criticizing it, could this affect the US position in international order in comparison with China? So which country will prevail in what the Confucius might say, the battle of a moral tempo?
Sorry, Yo, can you just repeat the last part of that first question? Can China ever be forced to admit its role?
Its fault in causing this pandemic.
Oh, okay, that's an easy one to answer.
And the second part is about the US pulling out of WHO. Can US remain influential?
Okay. Ying Hooi, do you want to go first on that one?
Well, you can go first.
Okay. Well, I think the first question is, as I said, really easy to answer. Can international pressure ever force China to admit its fault in the pandemic? The answer, of course, is clearly a resounding no. It won't. China has shown no sign of admitting any fault in the outbreak of the virus. Quite the contrary, it's created a narrative in which it seeks to obfuscate the origins of the virus, and it's spun a narrative that it gave the rest of the world, and particularly the United States, time to prepare for it, and they squandered that time, and hence they're paying the price now. So no, I mean, you know, when we saw what happened when Australia suggested that there be an international inquiry into the origins of the virus, that the Chinese were furious about this and sought to punish Australia for its temerity in proposing it through various economic measures. So no, we're not going to see that. I mean, not maybe until there's a new regime, a new government in China, many years from now. The US withdrawal from WHO is, I think, very unfortunate. I think the WHO did make mistakes in the early stages. I think perhaps some of the US criticism of it, that it was some of its leaders were beholden to China. There may be something in that, but that's something that needs to be looked at more closely and recommendations made and acted on. But it's also an indication of President Trump's lack of faith, lack of support for, enthusiasm for multilateral institutions. So it's just another sign of the Trump administration's position on how it doesn't value multilateralism at all. I mean, it really shouldn't surprise us, but it's disappointing. It's probably not the right thing to do.
Ying Hooi?
I'm not very sure which country should prevail, but I think while China, of course, won't admit the mistakes of when it comes to this pandemic, US as well. Trump will never admit the mistakes of how he managed the pandemic in the United States similarly. So that leaves us to the to open up the questions that in the Southeast Asia region, do we really still want to confine ourselves with the discourse that between US-China rivalries? I think perhaps academically, there needs to be a lot more discussions to go beyond the US-China rivalries, and maybe to bring in the, how about the middle power agencies that playing in the regions as the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and so forth. But I don't see, I don't think any of these two countries would prevail in this managing the pandemics. It's not a maybe they see it as a contest. Trump and Washington and Beijing definitely see it as a contest on how well they are and how successful they can manage the pandemic. But unfortunately, both have not really successful. China can claim that it's been successful, but it has been a lot of damage being done in terms of the measures that they are having as well, which is not something to be really proud of. Yeah.
Thank you. Our question to Ian from so far. There has been a speculation of the Chinese naval base in Cambodia. Many people have argued that if the case is true, the Chinese naval base will pose a major threat to the US Navy. But how?
Yeah, there's been a lot written about this in the last 18 months or so, this idea that China has signed a secret agreement with Cambodia to establish a naval base near Sihanoukville. I've seen the reports. I think there may be something to them, but I'm not totally convinced. What I suspect we're seeing here is that China is financing the construction of dual-use infrastructure, that there will be ports and airfields that will be capable of hosting warships and military aircraft, but that doesn't mean it's a Chinese base as such. I think that, the issue of bases is such a sensitive issue in Southeast Asian countries. I think it's politically unacceptable for most countries and for their neighbors as well. If China were to establish a permanent military base in Cambodia, this of course would be, the country that would see this as the main threat would be Vietnam, of course, not the United States. A naval base in Cambodia isn't going to threaten the United States Navy. And US Navy is still very strong and has access to lots of ports around the region. And I suspect that that's the model that China will use as well. The bases are too expensive. Bases are too expensive and they're too politically sensitive. And so why not sign access arrangements with countries that enable your armed forces to visit for a short time and then leave? I suspect that if there's any secret deal between Cambodia and China, it's something along those lines. I'd be very, very surprised to see China establish a permanent military facility of the kind that it has in Djibouti, in Cambodia or anywhere else in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, Yang. Next question is to Ying Hooi from Russia. This pandemic has made the state realize that they should pay more attention to self-reliance rather than the military and economic concerns alone. And both Beijing and Washington showing some issues with the leadership. Will we see less interdependence among the states and the states causing them to implement more self-reliant strategy or possibly alliance with Japan and South Korea, more regionally bound kind of partnerships?
I think there have been a lot of talk about the inward-looking policy by the most of the countries, not only in the region, but also cutting across the world, that is precisely where there's a lot of discourse about the failure or the weaknesses coming from the regional organizations like ASEAN or even the international organizations like UN, the multilateral corporations, because it's quite interesting that in the post-Cold War era, and then we talk about these multilateral corporations and things like that. But now the COVID-19 has kind of sent us another message that how about the regional corporations and the multilateral corporation that doesn't seem to really help much in terms of the pandemics, and that makes the countries prefer to look into the self-reliance approach, because in the Southeast Asia, even I think each country have their own different approach based on the different contexts. So the regional solidarity is really missing when it comes to this pandemic. But like the health sector and things that have been the assistance mostly, apart from the Vietnam when mentioned about the medical diplomacy, but mainly the assistance really come beyond the region itself. So this serves as a really a lesson for the Southeast Asia to look at the approach that they really want to have. Yeah.
Thank you. I have just enough time for one short question from Wang Yi and to Ian. I'll abbreviate the question. will ASEAN get closer to India, given the current context?
So India has aspirations to play a much bigger role in Southeast Asia, but when you look at it today, it's very far from achieving those aspirations at every level. Economically, the trade that India does with Southeast Asia is a fraction of what Southeast Asia does with China. India's military presence in Southeast Asia is very small, some ship visits, and that's about it. India's diplomatic presence in the region is also very small on account of the fact that India has, for a country of 1.3 or 4 billion people, has a tiny diplomatic service. In fact, it's only slightly larger than Singapore's or New Zealand's. So there's an absence of India's diplomatic presence in the region and around the world. And also when you think about it, I always think that India is kind of trapped in South Asia. It's surrounded by countries that it doesn't have very good relations with. It has this problem which has just flared up this week with China on its northern border. And other regions are much more important to India than Southeast Asia, the Middle East being the primary one because of India's oil dependence and the huge number of Indian workers there. And maybe even Central Asia is more important than Southeast Asia. I think Southeast Asians in general have been quite disappointed in India's lack of leadership in the region. I know that Singapore was very keen for India to join the East Asia Summit, and Singapore leaders have expressed their disappointment that it hasn't played a bigger role in the a more proactive role in the East Asia Summit and in other ASEAN-led forums as well. So will India and ASEAN have closer relations because of this? I think certain countries might, within ASEAN, might pursue closer relations with India. Vietnam being one, Singapore as well. I think Indonesia's relations with India are getting better, but when you look at it, they're still pretty thin. So maybe that situation will look very different 10 years from now or 20 years from now. But right now, India is just not a big player in the region. The two big players are China and the United States, followed by Japan. And then other countries are a long way down the list, like Russia and India. And I don't think that's going to change for some time.
Okay, thank you, Yang. Now we are approaching 9:30, end of the webinar. And I would like to express thank you again to both speakers. And at last, I have a short announcement. We're going to run several webinars this year. We plan to run the next one. We are in preparation. So if you are interested in receiving our advertisement for these events, please take a picture of the QR code and register yourself so that you will receive our newsletters. Well, thank you again, both speakers. And I also would like to thank the audience for very insightful questions and very active participation. I look forward to seeing you again next time. Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.